Good afternoon again, everyone. For those of you who've joined us over these past few weeks or past few months, welcome back. If you're new to all of this, then welcome. I believe this is in the high 20s, this number of webinars that we've done. Bonjour et bienvenue. Si vous avez nous joindre pour nos autres webinaires, merci. Si c'est votre première fois, très bien. On espère que vous trouvez la valeur aujourd'hui. I'm Mark Healy. I'm the Executive Director of the Ivy Academy. That's the Learning and Development Wing here at Ivy Business School in London. Je suis le chef d'éducation exécutif à l'école de commerce Ivy à l'Université de Western en Ontario. Well, what are we seeing out there in the COVID world in Canada these days? A bit of a mixed bag, I guess, if we're being a bit generous. Then the not so generous view would be a return to kind of a heightened state on a number of fronts, rising case numbers, reimposed restrictions, leading to, lots of us reading about more anxiety, mental health issues back in the news, isolation. A number of folks that I've spoken with lately, they put it kind of more simply. They just say they're kind of down and there just isn't a lot to look forward to right now. And workplaces and employers, of course, can't take full responsibility for this. On the other hand, there is more and more evidence of the impact that work has on individuals' lives beyond simply thinking about either the financial well-being or stress level of the employee. And there is this kind of movement toward a more fulsome view of employee well-being that's starting, and that's where we're going to take the conversation today. I'm excited about this one. We're really fortunate. We're going to be joined in the discussion by three fantastic guests. So today we have with us Karen Collins. Karen is Chief Talent Officer at BMO. We have Andrew Soren with us. Andrew is founder and CEO of Eudaimonic by Design. And we have Ivy and Ivy's Academy's own Dr. Mazi Raz, professor at the Ivy Business School with us. Before we start, though, I want to turn to our executive producer, that's Sean Acklin-Grant. Sean's with us as always. Sean, can you just take us through the flow of the session today, please?
Sure. Thanks, Mark, and welcome back, everyone. We're very excited about our panel today, as Mark said, and I know you are too. We've already received a few questions by email. You can submit new questions live during the session by clicking Q&A at the bottom of your screen, as well as upvoting other questions you'd like to see answered. Don't be shy. If we don't get to your question during the hour, we'll ask our panelists to respond with some thoughts as part of the follow-up article that we email out. We'll also be asking you in the audience some polling questions throughout the broadcast, really to get a sense for how this group is thinking as a whole about well-being during COVID. You'll see those if you're tuned in with a computer or mobile device, so get your clickers ready. All of our past broadcastings and sign up for future invites if you're not on the list already. This is actually live stream number 26 since March, and I know some of you have been signing up since the beginning. So to all of you, as well as everyone just joining us today, we appreciate your amazing engagement and participation and hope that you found these helpful. So again, I'll say a big thank you and throw it back to you, Mark.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Thanks for that. And let's get into it. So, Andrew, I know we wanted to start with you, and just kind of if we could set the context and kind of the boundaries here, kind of frame up what we're talking about. And I guess the way we'd set this up is, what is well-being, kind of in your view, and what do we know about well-being, kind of now that we didn't say 10 or 20 or 30 years ago?
That's a great question. The fact is, it's actually a really old question. What is well-being? What's flourishing? What's a good life? What's the pursuit of happiness? These are questions that we've probably been asking since the dawn of time. Is it about pleasure? Is it about purpose? Is it about a momentary thing? Is well-being about an analysis of your whole life? I'm a bit of a philosophy buff, so I go back to what the ancient Greeks thought of this question, which is probably they probably thought it was the most important question to be able to answer about our lives. At the end of the day, it's the goal of anything. Aristotle called it eudaimonia. The company that I run is called Eudaimonic by Design. Aristotle called well-being eudaimonia. And basically what he thought about 2,500 years ago was the fact that well-being was about a deliberate practice. It was all about unlocking our full potential to do the right thing. Similar ideas exist across the East and the West. You can look at Zen, Tao, Confucius, Hindu, Judeo-Christian, Muslim traditions. It's something very similar all there. These are really old questions. Of course, First Nations, Métis, Inuit have brilliant definitions of what well-being is long before any settler got to Canada. So I think what's different about the last 10, 20, 30 years is the fact that the social sciences are really starting to catch up to this really ancient question. I think about the history of psychology as a discipline. The history of psychology, when the discipline was founded, it was supposed to look at the whole spectrum of human experience, from languishing to getting by to flourishing. And for lots of really good reasons, over the course of predominantly the 20th century, psychology became just about focusing on what's wrong with us. It was about focusing on illness. Even if you think about what a psychologist does, the answer is they help people who are sick. The biggest textbook in psychology is the DSM, the Diagnostical Statistical Manual of Mental Illness. It's all about what's wrong with us. And really over the last 20, 30 years, there's been a correction, I would say, in psychology. Initially pioneered by a guy named Martin Seligman, who is president of the APA, the American Psychology Association, around the turn of the 21st century. He really said, we need to solve these problems of what's wrong with us, but we need to look at what's right with us with as much rigor. And I think that's really what's changed, is that over the last few decades, there's been this exponential flood of research on what well-being actually is. I Googled just before this session, I looked in Google Scholar, and terms like subjective well-being, which is really the scientific study of well-being. There's over 500,000 articles that have been written in the last 20 years about the topic. It's studied around the world. There's folks like Ed Diener, Gallup, looking at well-being globally all around the world. Increasingly, I would say that well-being is being used even in society as a measure that is as important as GDP to measure a society's success. I think that rigor is showing up in all sorts of ways. We have a better definition of what well-being actually is. Folks like Seligman, who I described, would describe well-being as our capacity to have pleasure, positive emotion, our capacity to be engaged, to have meaningful relationships, to have a sense of purpose, to be able to feel like we can accomplish things. It's being looked at systemically, whether psychological or physical well-being, but also in relationships and in community, economically, and at work. And I guess, in the context of this conversation, the work piece is really important. I mean, well-being at work now is a thing. Stock prices go up when companies have high well-being. There's a Deloitte study that says that over a 6-year period of time, the appreciation of stock values for companies that have high well-being is 76% higher than the average. It impacts customer experience and loyalty. Higher well-being leads to lower employee turnover. There's a big burning platform here. I mean, in Canada alone, the direct costs of not thinking about well-being is over $50 billion a year in terms of healthcare costs and income support. It's a $6 billion loss of productivity when we think about absenteeism, presenteeism, and turnover. And we can think about it the other way. Determining factors of what makes a great place to work have well-being at its core. It's the main driver of what's attracting talent for new generations. And I would argue it's the foundation of what it means to think about business from a stakeholder perspective. So I think those are some of the foundations.
Okay, so that's a big tent, piece of context. We're going to sharpen the context here in a second, but with that as the backdrop, Sean, I think we've got a first poll queued up just to try to get a beat on how the audience is feeling right now.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that now, and our panelists are welcome to vote as well. The question is, in the past 2 weeks, overall, I mostly felt like I was, and you have a few options that sort of represent a spectrum of well-being there. We're seeing about half the folks having voted so far.
This is great as we think about the voting on this. This question really comes out of work that a psychologist named Corey Key kind of has thought mostly about in terms of how we think about well-being This specific question actually comes from Michelle McQuaid in the way that she's modified it.
So I'm going to finish the polling with almost 80% of folks having voted. And if we take a look at the results, we actually see living well despite struggles, a vast majority. Yeah. Any comments on that, Andrew?
Yeah, I think that that's really reflective. I mean, you look around the world right now, and this is pretty much the kind of stats that we see around this kind of question. And I think it's really useful to think about this framework of thinking about well-being, that you can have high well-being or you can have low well-being, and you can be struggling or you cannot be struggling. And that it's not, having well-being isn't about looking at the world through rose-colored glasses. You know, this is a period of time where there's lots of struggle, and yet it's about really understanding that relationship of how do I struggle well, which becomes, I think, the defining question of our time.
Mazi, I'd like to bring you in. I think you've probably got a specific comment there. I would also like your sort of commentary on, you know, there's this kind of mythology about we're all in this together, which actually isn't true. Lots of organizations started the crisis in different spots, and the crisis has hurt or hit organizations kind of differently. And just how does that change the context of what we're talking about?
Yeah, you're right. And thank you for that question. Very quickly, a comment about the results of the poll. I personally voted that I'm living well despite of what's happening around us. But I'm also mindful of the fact that there are people who are not doing well and they're struggling. And that in and of itself should change my answer. Because if I answer individually, then I've missed the whole notion of well-being. If I have people around me who are struggling, then I'm now beginning to understand what well-being means. It's not an individual question or quest anymore. So I have to be very careful about how I answer that question. I am doing well, but if people around me are not, then I got to think very carefully about my own well-being and my own presence in the world. Now, returning to your question, there's a strong tendency of thinking about well-being as an issue, as a response to COVID and everything that started in 2020. But their story is actually a little deeper. And the reason it's a little bit deeper is that because we were already on some trends that were creating some significant challenges for individuals, organizations, societies. I'm not going to list go down a very long list, a few of them. We're getting a lot more connected with technology. Like almost all of us are pretty much augmented, constantly connected, but simultaneously a lot more disconnected in social relationships. We're a lot more asocial and isolated. And so that's what's happening. Number two is that we are seeing a lot of otherness taking place inside the society. So the questions about I am part of a tribe, someone else is part of a different tribe, and their differences, attention to differences is actually taking us further apart. And that is creating some highly volatile reactions to how I live and how I relate to other people. The third one, I think this is really interesting, is that people call this the Instagram narcissism. It's just a competition of constantly improving my self-image, whether I'm at work or outside. These collectively create a significant pressure and stress on an individual in performing in a society that goes far beyond what we had before. That's why how we think of well-being today is significantly different than what it was before, because the bedrock of a society is shifting a little bit. And some of these conditions are making it very difficult to remain constantly in the positive, I'm doing well and I don't care about everyone else around me stance. So that needs to change.
We've got a couple of comments in the chat, one from Lynn and one from Victoria about some likely audience bias that we've got here as well, that our audience doesn't reflect all of society, and that may reflect in the results as well, which I think are fair points. We want to bring this, we have largely a business audience. We want to kind of bring the conversation more into the business realm. So Sean, I think we have a second poll we're ready to tee up, and then we're going to bring Karen in and sharpen this conversation around business.
Sure. So this next poll is actually around ways that your organizations are supporting you, the audience. There's a few options, potential suggestions, as well as not applicable if no supports are available. So feel free to submit your anonymous responses now, and we'll give that a couple minutes.
While folks are answering this question, I'd love to just kind of dig into Lynn and Victoria, your comments a little bit, because I think that they're really accurate. And I think that one of the things that this period of time has taught us is that there's no well-being without fairness in society. There's a psychologist, a community psychologist named Isaac Pilantensky, who's very famous for talking about the relationship between fairness and wellness. And I think if we look at all of the social injustice that has risen to the surface and become very, very loud over the last 4 or 5 months within our organizations, I think that we see that point exceptionally clearly. So I think it's great, and I hope we come back to it later on.
I'm going to go ahead and share the results now. This was a multiple choice, so we encourage you to select up to 3 answers, but the most common response was an employee assistance or employment assistance program.
So Karen, you oversee, at least to some degree, maybe to a large degree, you oversee all this for a very large organization. And just wondering if you could talk a bit about your point of view on well-being, if you could maybe react to that poll and talk a little bit about examples that you think you've seen either within BMO or elsewhere.
Thanks for the question, Mark. And yeah, happy to be here with my academic friends and bring a business perspective. So maybe let's go back to June 2019. And at that moment in time, BMO launched our purpose, which was to boldly grow the good in business and life. And really, we did that because we wanted our colleagues to think more holistically about the responsibility that we all have to help our colleagues, our customers, and our communities find purpose in their work and life. And at the heart of this is a focus on well-being at a deeper level. And so our purpose puts well-being at the center of how we talk about achieving our goals. And of course, we did this long before the pandemic. But it really has become appropriate as we face more challenges. So when I think about BMO's commitment to purpose, we have 3 facets that we look at: a sustainable future, a thriving economy, and an inclusive society. And I really wanted to talk about all of those elements as they contribute to societal well-being, but in particular, our focus on inclusion and how that contributes to well-being as one element. We know, and I'm sure everyone on the webcast today would believe, a culture of inclusion and equity is the right thing to do. And we also know it's good for business. We see that in the data. We also know people who are a part of diverse and inclusive teams, and that's become even harder for us, whether it's working at home on a Zoom or a Teams call or working from work, as many of our colleagues are doing, to the comment in the chat. That depends on your perspective, but we have lots of colleagues who are working from work 6 feet apart in a mask, potentially commuting on public transit, and those stresses are different. But we know, regardless of where people work, if they work on a team where they feel included and as though they can bring their authentic selves to work, we know that they feel a greater sense of well-being, both collectively and as a group of individuals. And as Andrew said, we know, and we see this at BMO, that contributes to our competitive advantage and our ability to retain talent. So when I think about well-being and where I've seen it done particularly well, both at BMO and other places, it's not a one-size-fits-all, and it's not a once and done. It's really an ecosystem. So for me, it's that feeling of authenticity and inclusion that I talked about. The focus on emotional and mental health. And I think people said there were EAP programs that help with that. It's about physical health and safety, which is something that has popped up now over the last 8 months in a way we never really expected it to. And then it's also about psychological safety. And so what we've done at BMO to really bring this to life, and I know other organizations have done something similar, and I think it's very effective, is through a mental health wellness hub. And so it has resources with mental, physical, social, and financial resources that employees can access. It's very simple, all in one place, to be inspired on their wellness journey. We're also doing this by listening to the employee voice. We have 45,000 people who work for BMO. About 16, maybe now a little bit more than that, 1,000 are working from work, and the rest are now working from home. And we've always done employee listening, but during the pandemic, over the last number of months, always on listening has become so critical to our focus on well-being. And what I would say is we learned, and we didn't need a survey to do this, but it really gave us the data to know where to focus. So we weren't just focusing on the symptoms of people's stress in this environment, but what were some of the causes? And Andrew and I were just in the pre-call talking about, are there any silver linings to this pandemic? And there probably are. There are a few. And one I would say is with issues around well-being, mental health, issues around racial injustice. I've never heard the conversation louder, where people are talking about things that they didn't talk about before. And we're talking about things at our company, at our bank, in a way that is so much more authentic. We talk about it as the COVID license. And I really hope that when we get back to normal, and we will, that we can keep this conversation about well-being going, so that people can really feel the benefits of that post-pandemic. So really, to get back to answer the question, where have I seen this most effective? I've seen the most effective responses to well-being in organizations that don't just focus on one element. They focus on culture, as we have with our purpose. They focus on providing resources, and then also actions in a really deliberate ecosystem way. Some actions that we've done, just to be really tactical, happy to answer questions about these. We launched a virtual healthcare app so that people who did not want to leave their homes or wanted to limit how often they left their homes during the pandemic could get mental and physical health support through a virtual source. We've hosted Ask an Expert calls. We are great bankers. I'm an HR person, but we're not medical professionals. And so we got medical professionals on calls with our people, and we asked them to invite their families to those calls. We know with people being at home, the lines have blurred for most people. A lot of people are working from home now. And so having family in the conversation is super important. And then finally, which I think is something that's really important, as we were all living through the pandemic, the focus on racial injustice was something that really impacted a lot of people. Not new for many people, but certainly in a different way. And so what we've done to help people cope with that stress on their mental health was focus on providing resources to help with conversations about how to have a conversation with your team or your family or your kids about racial injustice. And in Canada, we've really focused on an e-learning, focusing on Indigenous people's history and reconciliation. And we really do that, to get back to my initial point, to help people know that we want them to bring their authentic selves to work. And we know when people cover and they can't bring their authentic selves to work, that's a real threat to their well-being and their feeling of well-being at work. So just to close, Mark, I think it's really an ecosystem of well-being, and companies that do it well don't just do a once and done. They focus on it on an ongoing kind of long-term journey towards well-being for their people.
Well, lots to dig into there. I want to do one follow-up, and there are a couple of questions from the audience I think we should get to right away. On bringing your authentic self to work. So I, of course, have read up on this a little bit. I do see different perspectives or definitions or takes on that, depending on the organization. What is your take on what that really means?
So for me and for us, it is being able to bring who you are as a person outside of work to work. And so not only to be tolerated for that, but to be embraced and accepted and celebrated for that. And I think that's become even more important when so many of us are working from home, where the things, and I remember early on in the pandemic, a colleague of mine, people were apologizing for their kids or their spouse or their roommate. And she said, which I just thought was so wonderful, and I think really epitomizes our approach to bringing your full self to work. Don't apologize for who you are outside of work. definition kind of has gone by the wayside. Who you are outside of work really is the reason that we're all working so hard right now. So really bringing who you are when you're outside of the bank to the bank is something that we want to celebrate. And we're doing that through many ways, through recognizing people's personal stories, if they're comfortable sharing those within our workforce. So it's something I've seen more and more over the last 8 months. And certainly I think it's enriched our culture and our work environment.
There's a specific question here about EAPs, and because it ranked sort of number one in our poll, I want to get to it. So the question, I'll paraphrase a little bit, but is my understanding is EAP systems or providers in general are kind of overwhelmed right now. They're cutting back on the lengths of sessions in order to try to get to as many folks as possible. And is that affecting, the experience of the individual? So just, I don't know if any of the three, I have no evidence or point of view on this, but does anyone have a take on that question? Are EAP providers stressed right now, and are they trying to do the right thing and accommodating and in fact degrading the experience?
Well, maybe I can start. And so that's one of the reasons we really were anticipating a lot of providers are stressed right now in terms of, medical providers, the whole health and medical system. So that's why we started the Ask an Expert calls. And so I would say, Mark, that I think we know that to be true. Anyone who's giving help, mental health, physical health help in this environment is overtaxed. And so that's one of the reasons that we did those Ask an Expert calls. We had doctors, we had physicians who support pediatrics, who support kids, and then we had parenting experts. And we've had over 20,000 people join us on those calls, and we recorded them because we knew the system would be taxed. And in a time when you may not be able to give individual help to the degree that you want, creating a resource for people to call into and to access after the fact. We've also really encouraged social networks. And I think about my experience during the pandemic, some of the best pieces of advice and some of the best moments of levity have been through my network, getting on a Zoom call with other moms and talking about the things that we're going through. And that doesn't augment professional help, but it certainly is something that we've encouraged our workforce to do and created facilities for colleagues to do that so they can share what's working and what they're struggling with in a way where we can help each other. I think someone said earlier in the call, we're all in this together, and that's really been the approach that we've taken to help out a system that we all know is a bit stretched at this moment in time.
Can I jump in for a second? Because I think it's a great question. And I think that it's really reflective of just when we think about this question of well-being, we immediately go to EAP, right? We immediately go to mental illness to a certain extent instead of mental health. Like that's in our immediate association. And I think it speaks to the fact that in so many organizations, there's actually very, very little focus on prevention. It's only a kind of treatment to a certain extent. And I think that organizations that are really doing something different right now are really focusing on that question of what is prevention? What can we do to inoculate our employee base so that they don't need to be so reliant on EAP when it comes. And I think that those are the things that I'm starting to see from a differentiating perspective that are really, really interesting, especially in COVID. I'm doing some work with a government agency right now that is responsible for giving out COVID dollars, and all of the people who are manning the phones are basically turning into grief counselors and social justice punching bags, and the question becomes, to what extent can we build the capabilities of people to be able to manage those kinds of conversations in a different way? What's the emotional carrying capacity we can give to people, which are very concrete skills. They're learnable skills that we can give to people to ultimately build their capacity to ground themselves, to set more effective boundaries, to understand how to manage their own emotions in the face of others, to ultimately do what they need to do do to, as Karen described, create the conditions for social support, especially when we're alone and we can't just tap on somebody's office and be like, wow, I just had the most difficult conversation. It's those skills and the deliberate efforts that organizations are doing to build that capacity that I think are making the difference right now.
Mazi, do you want to come in on this?
Very briefly, if I could, there's something that Karen said that it is really fascinating, and I think it's very true. However, I've also seen people misunderstanding that. When we invite people to bring your authentic self to work, underlying there is an assumption that it's your task and your responsibility, and only it's up to you to show up on the plate with your authentic self, right? And so we're kind of like outsourcing well-being to the individual and saying that you own it. It's your job to do this. If you fall below the line, and if you start suffering from mental health and illness concerns, then we'll come in with these broad EAP solutions for you. What Karen was suggesting that no, it's a lot more nuanced than that, and it's layered. The immediate layer above it is that we do want to provide the opportunities and the spaces for people to show up authentic to work and to be creative and to be highly motivated in doing so. So we have to be very careful of how we actually construct the organization, the structures of the culture before that to take place. And on top of that, not all the constituents have the same needs and respond to the same programmatic interventions. If we get to know our employees very well and be inclusive in the way that we approach well-being for them, then we start realizing that we may have to tweak different programs and different things that we do with them in different places. The example of, hey, why don't we just show up on Zoom and just simply talk about our lives, the example that Karen brought, it's very important because it brings light to the third dimension of wellness that is often misunderstood, which is the social dimension of it. We often think of well-being or wellness as physically fit and generally happy in life, but these two are not possible in absence of having social relations. And we just set the condition at the beginning that the world is making it a lot more difficult for us to be socially connected. So let us, as part of organizations, provide those opportunities. And that's why I think the nuance is really key. If there's only one thing to take away, is precisely that it's nuance, is not one large intervention and walk away from it.
Lots of comments in the chat here on the broad topic as well as on EAP. A couple of different perspectives, on EAPs. One being that the utility's actually been down a little bit, and the response has been excellent. So that's nice to see. A different one saying much more focus on prevention than on reaction, which is a theme we just talked about for the last 5 minutes for sort of obvious reasons. I want to do one more business question before we shift gears, and that's it may be sort of an obvious question, but if this is so important and you can imagine why it's so important, I mean, all of you have made a tremendous case here in the last few minutes. Why do we see such a varying response from businesses? Karen,
why don't I chime in, and then I'm sure Andrew has a point of view as well. I think Mazi just said it really well. Well-being is a complex topic. And so the response to well-being for a leader can really vary based on their own lived experience, their company's size, sector, geography, employee demographics. And I really agree, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and it's not a checklist or a once and done. And so I would love to be able to write a prescription for organizational well-being. We would all take it. And so as you think about it, there's varying ways organizations can approach well-being, ranging from a very data-focused cost avoidance model. So what drives the cost of absenteeism and short-term disability, and then invest in programs that address those things. And that's a perfectly good model. You can do that. You can range all the way to saying, I'm going to build a culture and have role model leaders who show us how to be great from a well-being perspective. And we see organizations who do that as well. both of those responses are reasonably effective, and we know companies that do that well. But there is never, in my experience, a single one-note solution. And as I said before, it takes an ecosystem and it takes a lot of time to build a culture of psychological safety and well-being. And so a range of responses is probably to be expected, and we need to build that ecosystem in order to be sustainable. What I would also say is, as the science evolves on the importance of well-being, I think we're seeing responses begin to change and adjust. And then you overlay a pandemic and racial injustice on the scenario and intense new threats to well-being, and that makes it even more complicated. So, and as my fellow panelists have said, we know that there's such a threat to well-being right now globally. And so I think this conversation isn't necessarily just a response to that, but I do think it's really timely. And we know with the pandemic, racial injustice, discrimination in Canada against our Indigenous communities, a lot of people are feeling that negative trend. So I think that it's part of the reason, as we're evolving to change our response to mental health, you will see varied responses. One thing that we've done that I just wanted to talk about, and I think goes back to building that ecosystem. I don't want to suggest that it's just an ecosystem within an organization, and I think Andrew referenced this earlier. We really need it to be a societal partnership. So with experts in the field, with academic institutions, with social services, with government. And so as an example, we at BMO partnered with CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And in January, so pre-pandemic, we launched a mental health playbook to help leaders be inclusive and reduce the stigma of people who had challenges with mental health. And so, of course, we did that before the pandemic. It's been particularly helpful over the last few months. And I really see that as a post-pandemic resource that people will be able to use as we get back to more work as normal, whatever that looks like. But just to really emphasize the point that pre-pandemic now and post-pandemic, experts in community, government, education, healthcare all really need to work in tandem with corporations, because it really is a societal problem or solution that we're looking for, versus just a great EAP program that may help someone in the moment, but won't change the ecosystem or change the culture.
Andrew, what's your view on this?
It's interesting that we're having this conversation in a business school. This is a very new conversation for business schools. I think that's the reality. I think that the playbook of what it means to be an operator in an organization has not traditionally held well-being as a priority. I mean, both Karen and I are HR professionals, and I think that within HR, even the focus has been much more on the resource than it has been on the human, and I think that's true for as long as disciplines like HR have been around. And so I think that there's, your question of why is this hard for leaders? I think it's partially because it's new. This way of thinking is different than the way that we've been thinking before. And I think that it is at odds with a shareholder mindset. There's been so much. If we don't even think about the pandemic for a second and go to that crazy world a year ago, when the business roundtable was prioritizing purpose, when we were having very different conversations about what the role of business is in society. I think that that whole shift requires you, when you start thinking about a stakeholder mentality, to put well-being first and foremost as competitive advantage and as core to what it is that you're doing in your organization. And I think that means that there needs to be different pressure from stakeholders all over the board, from leadership, from boards, from shareholders, and so I think that's a good reason as to why it's potentially been uncomfortable and why we see a range of response. It's also, I think that most people just don't know what to do. We don't because we don't teach it. I think that it feels like it's, we're swimming in a different swim lane, and that it's not our job to be thinking about people's personal lives. And yet, I think as the pandemic has taught us, there is no business if we don't think about the lives of the human beings who are working for us. So,
Mazi, is the research behind on this, or is it not translated to application yet?
The research is certainly behind on it, and we have been following down two tracks. One track is about what's called the mutual gains. How do we make sure that both employees and organizations benefit? And then we're looking at interventions around that. And then the other one is about, it's called conflicting interest. At what point would organizational interventions or leaders doing something for their employees becomes so costly that it's not in the benefit of the organization? Fortunately, we haven't gotten there. That's just a theoretical question. We haven't actually seen that. The difficulty comes from my perspective, and I think a little bit of knowledge about this, it comes for two reasons. Reason number one is that our society is very, how do I say this? We love the diet culture. We love getting the things that are not good for us out. Think about the caffeine out of the coffee. Think about the sugar out of Coke, or the carbs out of your food. We constantly are moving that way, and we think that's the notion of health. That's the notion of well-being. If we want to be really good, that's what we do. Look for what needs to be yanked out. What that does is that it creates a bit of a scientific approach, and we go down to the elements of it and find what is that core atomistic piece that needs to come out. Well-being doesn't work that way. And then the reason it doesn't work that way is that we had a very solid playbook for doing well from people strategy inside the organizations, from a job design to recruitment to performance management to employee security and pay equity and all that. We've actually narrowed down to fairly decent science. And some people know it better than the other ones, but it is pretty scientific. The last piece, the magical piece, the participation and engagement piece, which we're asking individuals to be authentic, to be creative, to be whole, that's not so scientific. And that requires a complex, creative approach, a lot of trial and error, and most of your benefits don't show up within your first quarter or your second quarter. It takes time to build it. That is why Karen's idea that to go after a purpose that is large enough, grand enough, and important enough will probably, quite likely, get people really quickly all aligned inside the organization and get them engaged on motivation and taking them forward. That's possibly why organizations who are courageous, they go down this path of looking at how do they inject energy and fuel for the last little piece of the playbook, which is engagement. It also works well when you actually have a very solid purpose.
I think what I heard you say there is that I can tell my wife, I had 3 experts tell me I don't need to take cholesterol out of my diet, and that for my well-being, I keep eating hamburgers because they make me happy. That's my main takeaway.
I can just stand up and you can take a look at how I look on camera. Absolutely in agreement with you.
Well, when Sean and I debriefed on this after the prep, and I think a point of view that we had was the analogy would be electric cars, right? Why haven't electric cars taken off like crazy? It's not because people don't like electric cars. It's because there's a gas station 3 miles from anywhere I am on the planet. It's the infrastructure or the ecosystem hasn't caught up with it yet, but it's coming. Everybody knows it's coming. And I wonder here about, we talked about this a little bit. I wonder about the role of public policy. I wonder about the role of government, right? And I wonder about the role of shareholders, particularly large shareholders that control chunks of the economy, who are still buying organizations that have fantastic earnings per share and aren't looking super deep. And I think it's kind of the whole point of that would be, it's amazing actually when you think about the organizations that are taking this on themselves without the macro, without all of that infrastructure being built around them and kind of driving the conversation forward. It's a pretty high bar that those businesses are holding themselves to, which is cool. We've got very little time left as usual, so we have to shift gears. Sean, I think we've got one more poll that we want to run. So can you tee that one up, please?
We do. That's right. So this last question is around barriers to well-being. Answer for yourselves what you think your biggest obstacle to achieving a greater sense of well-being has been.
So as that one's running, I think what we want to do with the time left here is we want to react to this poll, talk a bit about the future and where we think we're going collectively, and then maybe we try and take 2 or 3 more audience questions if we've got time.
Okay, so we've got a good number of results now. I'll share those. Unsurprisingly, not enough time. The enemy of us all.
So Andrew, maybe we'll start with you. Is that what you would expect? Do you tend to see results that are all over the place?
No, I think that it comes. I think that it's brilliant. It is. I think it speaks to our mindset and priority, right? Like if we don't prioritize our well-being, from a time perspective, we only have so much time in the day. We have to be able to make choices, and so at the end of the day, I think that this reveals what is considered important in organizations and in our jobs and in our work, and what is not considered important. And to me, the thing that is so powerful about thinking about the fact that we don't have enough time to focus on our well-being is what the dire consequences of that are for our capacity to thrive as organizations. And I think the thing that's most powerful about it is the fact that there's so much of it that's actually within our control. We're the ones who control our calendars. We're the ones who can make different kinds of habits and choices and create the time.
Karen, we've seen lots of examples in organizations around innovation where simply creating the time and space for innovation leads to innovation. Do we need to create time and space for well-being?
I absolutely think we do. And so interesting, I've had a lot of conversations about this, as many of us got a whole bunch of time back in our day because we were no longer commuting to work. In my life, all of a sudden I was working, as I still am, in my basement, no events, no kids events, no social engagements. All of a sudden you had so much more time, and yet it disappeared. And in a moment in time where I had probably 10 hours a week more than I would have commuting to the office or sitting on the side of a baseball diamond, it didn't feel like there was more time to focus on wellness. But that wasn't because there wasn't time. That was because I was prioritizing other things. And they were important things. They were ensuring my family, my team, 45,000 people, their wellness was taken care of. Their physical and mental health was my priority versus my own. And a mentor of mine said to me, "What do you want your pandemic legacy to be?" And it was such a wake-up call for me. It wasn't the excuse of time. It was how I was choosing to spend my time. And I wasn't paying attention to my well-being cues. I was ignoring those at the focus of other things. So I do think it's a bit, Mark, about focus, but I'm as guilty as the next person. I'm not being critical, but I don't think it's about not having enough time. I think it's to your question about organizations and individuals prioritizing well-being as something that is one of the most critical priorities during the pandemic, but really always.
Let's shift toward looking toward the future. Mazi, I'm sure you've got a view, and I don't know if you want to bridge off that point, but that's where I'd like to sort of go next. Is where do we think this is all going?
I personally think that this is not just a temporary conversation only related to COVID, and we're done with it when COVID disappears. I don't think so. I think there's so many things in the backdrop happening that well-being becomes a lot more important. I think about it this way, that we kind of know that the direction that the organizations are taking, especially large organizations, is more and more automation. And if we're going down this path, the role of the individual becomes a lot more creative, a lot more doing the decisions that Siri or Alexa cannot do. And so the value of well-being suddenly increases. And we probably have to have a long-term view of this. We would benefit thinking about this is not just something that we need to do with smaller interventions or just simply very quick programs. We've got to think about it And we've got to think about it not just within the organizations, but within the society at large, because we need to prepare the talent base for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years down the road as well. And if we do not invest in those right now, in the well-being of the immediate generation, the future generation, then we're quickly going to find ourselves at a cliff, not being able to attract, retain, and engage the employees that we need for the organization to prosper. This is a long-term conversation, and we need to take very serious attention towards it.
Andrew, what's your view? Where's all of this going?
I think it's simple. I mean, I think it's competitive advantage is the short answer to the question. I think that well-being is the way we're going to get high performance in the future. You know, there was a question much earlier on about what's the difference between employee engagement and well-being. And the fact is, if you look at the data, they're very, very highly correlated. So when you have high well-being, you have high engagement, but it's not the same. They're actually spirals. If high engagement feeds high well-being, but high well-being is the thing that actually drives engagement even further. So you can get to a ceiling of engagement. And if we define engagement in most of the employee surveys we take, it's about discretionary performance, intent to stay and loyalty to your organization. Like those are usually the ways that we define employee engagement. If we think about what well-being means from this rich definition that we've talked about today, truly feeling like I have a sense of purpose and meaning in the job that I do, feeling like I'm really engaged and in flow in the work that I'm doing, feeling like I have this psychological capital to be able to be resilient in challenging times and get through struggle, our capacity to build really extraordinary teams, like that's the ingredients to high performance. And so that's where I think where we're going.
Karen?
Yeah, I think where we're going, and I'm going to pick up on what Mazi said, some of the things in my work portfolio are inclusion, our culture, our well-being. And all of those things for me are a journey. And that's, I think, what makes it compelling and challenging. And for all of us, you think you're making great strides, you're getting it right. And then something comes along, like a global pandemic, that makes you really reflect and recommit. And so it's easy to feel a bit daunted and deflated. And for me, it's the moment of pause, to take a stand, acknowledge there's more to do, and then set the course forward with resilience. And so as I think about where we're going, there will be more challenges. Some of them will accompany the pandemic. Some of them will accompany new things that will happen in our world. But I think as an organization and as a society, and I mentioned this earlier, one of the silver linings for me of the last 8 months has been the depth of conversations people are having about how they're doing, not what you see on their Instagram, not what they wear to the office or what kind of car they drive, but really how they are doing. People have reconnected with family members. People have felt a sense of loss of things that they had taken for granted. And so I do think that will help us recommit to well-being as we come through the pandemic and think about new ways of working in what hopefully soon will be a new world.
Excellent perspectives. Fortunately, we have a little bit of time left and we have a lot of audience questions. So we're not going to get to all of them, but I would like to try to get to 1 or 2 or 3 if we're really lucky. Sean, I feel like we should do steps first because it's been upvoted so much. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so a question from Steph. There's often a stigma for those who go on stress leave and return to work. What strategies should companies take on to ensure this is no longer an awkward or uncomfortable experience for the employee who comes forward?
So maybe I can start. I have a couple of suggestions, a couple of ideas, and it's an excellent question. So for me, there are 2 things. One of which is role models. Having senior leaders within the organization who have taken either personally or to support family a step away from work to manage a mental health event, they need to talk about it. And we have had a lot of success at BMO. It's funny, I was looking for someone to talk on this exact subject a few years ago, and I sent out an email to senior leaders. I was overwhelmed by the number of senior leaders who were open and who would talk about their story. So one for me is role modeling. Two is training and education for managers. I took a step out of HR for a few years, and I went and I ran some retail branches. And, a lot of people who are managing big teams of people don't have the language or the knowledge or the training to understand how to bring someone back into the workforce in a way that acknowledges the struggles that they've been through. It's a little bit easier if that person has a broken leg or they had a heart attack. People don't understand the nuances of how to work with folks who are reintegrating into the workforce after a mental health break. And so I think those for me would be the two things: one, role modeling, and two, learning, training, education.
Okay, that's excellent. I'd like to get to another one. Andrew, maybe you could take this one with working with your clients. So the question is from John. A sense of well-being seems to be dynamic day to day. I would think there's some context to this in the current period. How do organizations help to manage highs and lows?
Yeah, that's a great question. It makes me think about, so measurement, I think, is really to jump to the question to my recommendation for future. I think that measurement's a really important thing here. We manage what we measure, but I think that the way that we think about measuring well-being in an organization is actually very different than the way that we think about measuring, for example, employee engagement. I think that we have to realize that the well-being does have highs and lows. It changes on a day-to-day basis. It's complex, and it's highly personal. And the goal of well-being in an organization, or thinking about well-being, or measuring well-being, or asking about well-being, is not every day it's going to get higher and higher and higher and higher. Like that's a ridiculous way of thinking about ourselves as human beings. Some days are great and some days are crappy. And it's a little bit like yoga. Like, the thing that we are doing when we're practicing yoga is trying to figure out, how do I actually feel while I'm doing the pose today? And that becomes, I think, the important question. That's the skill from a managerial perspective, which is basically what Mazi said earlier. We need to get better at being able to have the conversation, to check in with people, to listen authentically, to have empathy, and to be able to just hold space for both the highs and the lows and all of it. So, John, I think your question is the point.
Let's do one last one, Mazi. Maybe to you. There's a question around the role of boards of directors when it comes to well-being and the role that directors play. I know I've got a view here, but I'd be curious to get yours.
There is actually a lot of research being done about the role of leaders in general, being boards or managers or bosses. A lot of the work is actually coming from Stanford. Three people doing excellent work on this one: Mazi Raz, Bob Sutton, and Jeff Pfeffer. Jeff Pfeffer has a new book out called Dying for the Paycheck. And he actually brings a great deal of examples of what is happening right now in the corporate world and in larger organizational world, that people are missing the point of relating to their employees, and the notion of being a good and effective leader or a board director is. And he's just opening up the ideas that we need to rethink of what the role of those leaders are. And when we do that, we realize that how much more beneficial it is for the society, for the organization, for the stakeholders and the employees. It's not trading one versus the other, as it may happen in many of the organizations. I'd encourage people to actually look up the work that is being done at Stanford. It's exceptional.
Thank you. As usual, we're up against it on time. Sean, can you just remind the audience what happens next?
Sure. Yeah. If you're interested in learning more about our work, visit us online at ivacademy.com or follow us on your preferred social network. We post regular resources for leaders and organizations on our blog, and we'll be sending out an emailed link to this session's recording that you can share with your colleagues. We'll collect the poll results, any remaining questions, and some of the resources that were mentioned as well to include with that recording. Back to you, Mark.
Okay, fantastic. We've got to sign off. So Karen and Mazi and Andrew, just great job, tremendous job. Thank you to all of you for saying yes and doing a fantastic job today. And to our audience, thank you for being with us again. And we'll see you next time. Take care.